Hey everyone, today we're joined by a star of professional wrestling. He's been involved in the industry for over 2 decades, known for his time in various British wrestling promotions, appearances with TNA Wrestling, and of course with WWE as part of NXT UK. Dave, sir, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning.
Likewise, I'm a big fan of yours. I was talking to you off camera where, I'm from the United States, obviously, so I didn't necessarily get to follow a lot of your independent wrestling career. It was more towards the tail end with Progress. And then, of course, WWE, where I was such a fan of your work. And, I was just, once we were able to arrange this, I was so excited. So thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you.
Now, before we get going, I like to start and end the show with plugs. Where can people check you out? What should people look for?
I'm on Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days as at Dave Mastiff. No blue check mark because we got those all taken away, didn't we, for whatever reason, for whatever it's worth.
Nice.
And Twitter as at Real Dave Mastiff. I'm on Threads as at Real Dave Mastiff as well, but I haven't even posted there because, well, I don't know. It doesn't seem to be the most interesting place. But yeah, that's where you can find me. I do interact with people. Not all the time, but I do interact. So if people want to get in touch, they can always reach me through those.
Very cool. And guys, just as a reminder, we will have links in the description to everything Dave Mastiff. So please check it out, show some support. Like I say every time, these people are coming onto the show and giving their time to entertain. So likewise, show some support back to them. All right, so let's just get right to the beginning. The thing I like to start, I always say I grew up in the quote unquote shoot interview era, right? So I saw the high spots, the RFs, all that stuff, and everything was always, when did you first see pro wrestling? And I grew up with that, and I'm always fascinated. When did you first see it? When did you become a fan?
I think I first saw pro wrestling on the British holiday camp circuit. So around the coastal towns in Britain,
Oh
we
wow.
have holiday camps, and usually the wrestlers turn up there once a week. It's a small show, so it's a ring. It'll be four wrestlers and a referee. They set up, they put on a 1 hour show, and then they set the ring down and they drive to the next town. You do doing that. They probably do two, sometimes three jobs a day in different towns. And it would have been when I was maybe about 4 or 5 years old on holiday with my parents that I saw one of these shows, and that would be my first introduction to professional wrestling. And from there, I saw what would have been, I think it would have been WWF Superstars on Sky Television when I was around 6 or 7, perhaps, when we had it put in at my parents' house, and kind of fell in love with it from there. And then I got to see a couple of like local town hall shows with uh, some of the stars of British wrestling. Um, can't really remember many, but obviously the big name in British wrestling through the 70s and 80s was Big Daddy, and I remember seeing him when I was around 6 or 7 years old, obviously at a local town hall show. So that's kind of when I became a fan, and
That's so cool.
I kind of dipped out of it a little bit when I went into what we call secondary school over here, and it was a, kind of about 96, 97, so just pre-Attitude Era. I think that's when, if you look back over the history books and stuff like that, that's when business started to dip a little bit in the United States, and it kind of, I think people just kind of fell out of love with it just a little bit. But then by the time 98 rolled round and the Attitude Era became a little bit more prevalent and in your face, obviously, uh, kids at school started watching it again. And I thought, well, hang on a minute. I used to watch that when I was younger. Why is everyone so hyped up about it? Why is everybody crotch chopping everyone kind of thing? So I think I stuck a pay per view on. I think it was shown on Sky Sports over here, and I think it was maybe Royal Rumble or SummerSlam. I can't remember which one it was, but it was around '98, and I watched it in the crowd with red hot, the signs everywhere, and it was kind of it was definitely a different era from the 2 3 years previous when I stopped watching for that little bit. So, and from then it was, I guess it's always been in my blood.
Something about that's curious to me because, I try to pay as much attention as I can to the wrestling scene, both past and present. Obviously, I'm not as familiar with the UK scene as a lot of people who would be local. At one point, I know obviously it was flourishing. You know, you had World of Sport, and then that was taken off the air. For you, when you were a fan and stuff, like I'm pretty sure that was kind of like the lower point, right, for British wrestling at that point, where it was starting to kind of die off for a little while, right?
Yeah, so British wrestling, I mean, there's probably somebody on Twitter who's involved in British wrestling or a British wrestling historian who's probably going to correct me on this. But as far as I'm aware, it got taken off TV in 1988. The Director General of what was ITV decided that wrestling was too lowbrow and he wanted more high-end products on his programming, and they moved it to a graveyard slot really late at night, and obviously viewership fell off. And it was a tired old format that was coming up, that was on TV in those days. It wasn't as exciting, and obviously that was that kind of time, 1988, where Britain as a wrestling scene was kind of stagnating. There was still so much talent, and you look at the guys that came through, you know, guys like Regal, Finlay, Taylor, Robbie Brookside, Danny Collins, Johnny Saint was still around, Mike Jordan, you know, lots of guys. There was a lot of talent still, but the format that they were being shown in was really dated. One centre spotlight in a smoky town hall with one solo commentator, the great Kent Walton. But WWF at the time had just got into this rock and wrestling type thing, and there was celebrities, larger than life gimmicks, and you know some real kind of rock and roll, involvement in the wrestling, all the pizzazz, the fireworks, and the show business. And in Britain, it was for the most part a couple of guys who looked like they'd just come out the pub or from a shift down the mines or in a factory, and decided to have a bit of a scrap, a bit of a straightener, and because of that, that's obviously why it looked a bit tired and got taken off air eventually. And I think I don't think it fared too badly in the late 80s and early 90s in terms of its live touring and live shows. But then I think mid 90s it kind of died off a little bit, and it became a more difficult time for people to get work, especially the wrestlers. And it was kind of a forgotten entity, even in Great Britain. And if you spoke to someone in that mid to late 90s and you said about pro wrestling, then that person would then, that kind of instant association would be WWF,
Mm-hmm.
because all that American stuff, because World of Sport or British Wrestling had been off TV for a good 6-7 years by that point, and then the instant association was what they see on TV. So it was either WWF and Superstars and the pay-per-views, or even the on Saturday afternoons they used to show WCW Worldwide on TV as well. So it became wrestling became that American thing over here, and that's when I think viewership in terms of the live events started to peter off a little bit. And it wasn't until the Attitude Era actually kind of caused a little bit of a boom again, a bit of a resurgence. And it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't British stars or anything. It was, unfortunately, it was what they call tribute shows. So there would be guys dressing up as Kane or Undertaker or Sergeant Slaughter, Legion of Doom, things like that. I mean, they had to do it, they had to get paid, they had to make money, they got, families to feed, but it didn't, it wasn't British wrestling, so to speak, if that makes sense.
I appreciate you bringing that up because that is something that I plan to talk about later on. But since you brought it up, I'm so fascinated by it because I would see those, those old ads. Sometimes they'll pop around on Twitter or X or whatever you call it, or Instagram. And, you'll see, it's a fake Kane and not that fake Kane, but a British fake Kane. And you have all these like kind of rip-off gimmicks. And it's interesting because there was that kind of stuff way back in like the 50s and 60s in the United States where Jack Pfeffer, I believe is how his name's pronounced. And he had like, a fake Bruno Sammartino, and he would just change the name a little bit so people would be thinking it's the real one and they would come to the shows. Was that the kind of same idea? Like when you say tribute shows, was it kind of a deceptive practice where it was like, okay, we can trick people into thinking it, or was it like legitimately like a cover band?
It was more of a cover band, so people were looking at the people would see the posters and they wouldn't assume it was going to be the real deal, but the promoters were cashing in on the new popularity of pro wrestling through the Attitude Era, and they're advertising these people that looked like, to a degree, certain stars, and they would change the names very slightly. So instead of Legion of Doom, it was Legend of Doom, things like that. So it was quite silly, but it was never a deceptive practice in my mind anyway. It was more of just an opportunity to try and cash in on the popularity, and promoters going, well, we don't have any stars in British wrestling, so we need to somehow appeal to people to get them in.
Skipping ahead a little bit, but I am curious, when you broke in, was that still in play, or was that kind of a bygone era by that point?
A little bit, not much. It was kind of there was like one promotion who would use that kind of business model, and everybody knew it. I think in a way it used to upset a few people who were trying to obviously run their shows and make a serious product surrounding British wrestling again. And then at the town hall the next month after them, or at another venue in the same kind of town, whereas their show is, they would have this tribute show, so to speak, and it would upset a lot of promoters because they felt like it was undoing their work almost.
It's very interesting. That's very interesting. You talked about you saw Big Daddy at the tail end, and you were seeing, some local people who go on to be British legends or were British legends, and then of course the WWF. Who were some of your favorite wrestlers growing up? Was it more the British stars? Was it more the WWF stars? Who did you gravitate towards?
It would have been the WWF guys, simply because wrestling was taken off TV in 1988, and I was so young. I was like 3, 4 years old when it got taken off. So I would have no recollection of any of who those people were at the time. So for me, it was Hulk Hogan, British Bulldog, Randy Savage, the Rockers. That kind of. They were the kind of guys that I look forward to watching and seeing on TV.
And then I'm guessing in the Attitude Era, it was either Austin or The Rock or someone of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, it was both of them. It was Austin and Rock. I thought they were both phenomenal. Um, and I think as well as that, there was a kind of, it was wild. If you look back at the Attitude Era times and you look at the reactions for everyone, I'm not saying everyone was a complete enough superstar, but there were so many guys who were over
Hmm.
and instantly recognizable, and probably did great merchandise sales, things like that. So it was a little bit of a golden era for those kind of guys. You like I say, I'm not saying like, D'Lo Brown and guys like that. They weren't as over as Steve Austin, but man, they're still pretty over. The music hits,
They
and
were
you listen to
stars.
the reaction. Yeah, stars exactly.
Now, what I'm curious about, and I love to ask this question because people can take it into one of two directions. It can either be A, you didn't think someone's particularly good, or B, which is more of a compliment, they were such a good heel that you couldn't stand them. Were there heels or people that you just didn't like as a kid that, or you hated or detested?
I detested Ric Flair,
Okay, okay.
mainly due to the 1992 Royal Rumble, where he kept rolling under the bottom rope and getting out of there. So the whole, so he was obviously being a coward, and as a 7-year-old kid or whatever, that was pretty infuriating. Um, and I think obviously it was a very innocent time, like looking at my childhood, so I didn't necessarily think anybody like sucked. It was genuine hatred of that persona,
Mhm.
and also I think Ric Flair, and a lot of the guys they engineered to go towards Hogan, such as Yokozuna and things like that. Sid, that they were, I hated them because obviously they were going after one of my idols.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, my favorite growing up was The Undertaker, right? So even
Yeah,
if I loved somebody, as soon as they were feuding with The Undertaker, I would hate him. Like Kane, I loved Kane eventually, but when he was feuding with The Undertaker, I was like, Kane's the worst. Mankind
yeah.
was the same thing. Actually, since you brought up Hulk Hogan, since he was like probably your favorite as a kid, when he turned heel in 1996, where were you at with that?
So in 1996, I wasn't really watching.
Oh, it's when you were
Um,
falling out.
yeah, and I kind of came across that like a little bit later. And I was always majorly watching WWF, and it wasn't until the late 90s I really started watching WCW. The way it used to work in the UK here is Raw would be shown on a Friday night at 10 p.m. on Sky Sports, and on what was the channel? And on TNT we used to have WCW Nitro shown on the Friday night, but because that was 3 hours, that used to start at 9. So as a 14, 15-year-old teenager or whatever, Friday night would be 9 p.m. Nitro for the first hour, 10 p.m. switch over to Raw, watch that till midnight. Then, like I said, I'd go to sleep, and then my brother would come and wake me up at 5 a.m. in the morning to take me to work with him. So it was pretty rough as a teenager like that.
Yeah, not getting a lot of sleep, but I
Yeah,
guess you needed to get used to that with wrestling, right? It was a good prep.
yeah, exactly, definitely was. So yeah, just get on with it, don't you? That's that's the kind of place I'm from. That's the kind of ethos that was instilled in me from a young age and stuff. My parents are working class, and you got to get up, you got to go to work, and you know get on with it, don't moan. So it's just always what we did.
I love it. Now, this is the golden question. When did you decide you wanted to be a pro wrestler and what was your in?
Okay, so obviously wanted to do it from when I was really young. When I first started on TV and things like that. Um, but seriously, I think when I was about 15, and I kind of had a light bulb moment watching watching Raw on that Friday night. And I mean, for whatever reason, it kind of just occurred to me that the guys I'm watching on TV were all adults, and this was their work, this was their job. And I kind of thought, well, that's what a great way to earn a living. And that's how I kind of thought, well, I want to do this, I want to pursue this. Um, my in was a bit more complicated because at the time there was maybe I think there was maybe two wrestling schools in the whole of the UK
Oh
at that
wow, okay.
time. One on the south coast in Portsmouth, and one out southeast in Kent. FWA was in Portsmouth. Hammerlock was in Kent, and I'm from the Midlands, so it was 15, 16 years old. It would be public transport because my parents weren't going to drive me 3 hours to roll around and act like an idiot. You know what I mean? Um, it wasn't really an option, and I mean, I just anytime there was a local show, and I'd go to the local show and try and speak to someone, and didn't really get anywhere. And then one day I was at my local leisure centre. Um, and I went to play squash with my brother, and I saw a poster, and it said professional wrestling training Sundays 12 noon till 5 p.m. So I called the number and said, can I come? And they said, yeah, of course. And I turned up, and it was just a sports hall, like a rec centre sports hall, and there was some rolled out judo mats, no ring, and some crash mats, and some gymnastic boxes to jump off to do high flying stuff, and that was it.
Who was it who actually ended up training you? And I'm curious about like who you were training with.
Okay, so at the start it was a guy called Kevin O'Neill,
Okay.
um, and I mean, like I wouldn't give him the credit for training me because I learned the very basics there. So I learned how to take your back bumps and do your basic moves. I didn't really learn the art of professional wrestling there, but you know, I'm not going to discredit him. That was my into the business, and I started again doing my training, started doing some shows. So that's where I started. And as far as who I was training with back then, the the people who kind of came through would have been there's a couple of guys on the UK scene called the Hunter Brothers. They were there, and Joel Allen, who used to referee for NXT UK, he was there. And really, apart from that, nobody else came through and had any kind of distinguished career, really.
What was the average training like at that point? Because you talked about just doing the basics, so I'm guessing a lot of rolls, a lot of bumps, maybe some chaining.
Yeah, so it was essentially, it was 5 hours. We used to train for on a Sunday once a week, and it would be a kind of little stretch, couple of laps of the hall to get warmed up. Start your rolling, um, then just practicing your bumps, and then we'd practice a few move techniques, some hip tosses, body slams, and at first you practice them on the big crash mats, the thick crash mats, but after that we're then doing it on the judo mats, and it would it was the judo mats was just rolled out and it was just one on top of the other. And while you got your wrestling boots on or your amateur boots on, and you're kind of running around and kind of moving and stuff like that to emulate being in the ring or doing your moves and chaining them together and things like that. And the mats used to move and expose the wooden floor. So there was loads of times you'd end up taking a bump and just bumping on a wooden floor, which was always a lovely surprise for you.
Now, back then, oh, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's fine. Go on.
Well, what I was going to say is back then, I know physically you weren't as strong and as big as you became later on. So at that time, like, was it more difficult? Because I don't know specifically then if maybe you got smaller later, but was it difficult for you at that time with a smaller frame?
No, not really. I mean, the thing I said this years ago to someone. In terms of professional wrestling, I would have walked through fire to be a professional wrestler.
Mm.
So nothing was ever going to stop me. My size, I mean, I was a little bit smaller, but not drastically smaller. But I was very, as a human being, as a man, when you're only 16, 17,
Yeah,
you're not fully developed. So it's it can be a little bit more punishing. But I don't know, your body becomes callous to professional wrestling. And the more you do it after a certain amount of time, a bump's a bump and you don't really feel it. And, then later on in your career, when you go on to do something to crowds and big crowds and exciting opportunities and things like that, the adrenaline takes over and, it doesn't hurt.
now, skipping around a little, I know that you do a lot of training for people these days. Could you talk a little bit about what you do with training and how it differs and what similarities there are to how you came up?
So, I mean, for the training that I do with the other people, a lot of it is obviously based on past experiences for myself and what I've done, both in terms of in the ring and also the training I've had with different people. So nowadays, we in the UK and all over the world, there's a lot more opportunity to become a professional wrestler and go and train at a good academy or a good venue that has a professional ring, that maybe has a weight section. There might even be shows if you're looking stuff like that, as opposed to some rolled out judo mats on a rec center floor. So the facilities are better, and the training for me, I just try and take stuff that I've learned from people along the way. So I will, I mean, personally, I always think like your most important thing is your rolls and learn how to roll, control your body. Uh, that helps with your footwork as well. So you're doing that, that's the kind of first phase. And then you're looking into the contact stuff. So you're locking up, you're bumping. And then, drills are all individualized. Sometimes I use drills purely for timing, just so people get used to working together. And then the further you get, the more we develop that psychology of professional wrestling, and the drills then make sense, tell a story, plant seeds, and things like that. And but with everything I do, I always try and underpin it with the best psychology possible. And I mean, I learned that from Rip Rogers, and he, all the drills you do, you're not doing something for the sake of doing it. So every time I teach a drill, there's a reason why everything in that drill happens, and that's drills that he's shown me. That's drills I've created for myself. There's no drill that's done just for the sake of doing a drill, because that's pointless. That's boot camp basically. That's punishing people physically. You know, I want people to learn. I want to teach people. I want to inspire people. So therefore, everything we do has a purpose and has a meaning.
I guess I'm curious if this is kind of the concept. In general, people talk about a bump card, right? There's only so many bumps the human body can take. So while you have to do them a lot early on so you can get used to it and do it properly, I'm guessing the thought process is you want to maximize as much of that as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Bumping's one part of it, of pro wrestling, and it's the real physical part and the damaging part to the body.
Mhm.
I once read a doctor's report who said that every time you take a bump, it's the equivalent of getting hit by a car at about 10, 12 miles per hour. So it's pretty severe, and the body can only take so much, but it's important that you prepare your body for that as well. But you never know when you're going to take a bump and something could go catastrophically wrong. So I would never punish people for taking bumps. And I'm not the kind of person that thinks I'm not going to save people bumps uh, just to be nice, but I'm not going to make people do stupid things or take stupid bumps with no reason. And I mean, well, to be honest, I say take stupid bumps. There's no need to take stupid bumps. After this long in professional wrestling, I've seen all the bumps, I've seen all the moves, I've seen all the head drops. It doesn't impress me, so there's no point in doing them. And I'm not gonna, I wouldn't get someone just there taking back bump after back bump, and especially when it comes to a certain stage in a professional wrestler's development, there's absolutely no need for them to be in a ring taking bump after bump after bump, because it's just damaging for the body.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and that's another subject that comes up on the channel. Why not just specifically with training, but even like one thing I always find interesting is when you're new, you want to get as much work as possible because you need to learn how to work and you need to learn to work from the crowds. But then at a certain point, you have to start being more selective with your bookings, both for physical health, so your schedule's open for other opportunities, for pay reasons, and stuff like that. And I always find it interesting about what the philosophy is in that regard. And I know we're jumping all over the timeline, but for you specifically, what do you think that line is? Like, at what point do you have to balance working as much as you can to learn, but it being a business and your own health in the process?
Well, your own health is 100% paramount, because a lot of people won't have very long careers. I've been quite fortunate that I've wrestled for 21 years and I'm healthy. But some people may only wrestle for 5, 6 years, and to punish themselves and to sacrifice their health, then that's going to be so negative in the long term. When they're 50 years old and they've got children and grandchildren and they can't do the basic things, when they wake up in the morning and get out of bed and they struggle to put their own socks on, then that's when the regret will hit them. And if they say, I don't regret it, well, okay, more power to you. But your health's first and foremost. That's what, in professional wrestling, you look after yourself and you look after your opponent. They're two non-negotiables, in my opinion. So, in terms of but we've got to be realistic. It's a physical pursuit. There's lots of physicality, and there's injuries that are, you know, inevitable in some capacity. But there's still, for me personally, you still have to. I hate the phrase "do the reps," but You still have to work regular, you still have to work often. And really, it's a case of the more you work, the smarter you become. And you see some guys who've been around for a long time, and some of the younger guys will say, "Oh, you don't want to take that many bumps or anything." And that's complete and utter rubbish. It's not that people don't want to take bumps, it's just that you have to factor in the fact that in professional wrestling, when you're taking a bump, you're hurting yourself, you're damaging your body, and you have to weigh up the risk and reward factor. And I always say to people that there's very few occasions in history that people will remember people taking certain bumps,
Mm-hmm.
Like Foley coming off the cage and things like that. But you think about all the bumps that Mick Foley took in his career, and how many people remember what percentage of those bumps. They remember the one off the cell or an elbow drop. They probably remember a handful of bumps that he took.
Yeah,
and that's it. That probably works out to 0.000 something percent of the bumps he took in his total career. So people have to realize that the fans don't really care about these bumps. They care about you. They care about your your personality. They care about your character. They have a feeling towards you in some capacity, whether that's hatred, whether that's love, jealousy, whatever it is, the whole remit of human emotions. They have to have that human connection to you on that kind of level. And that's what people remember. No one, like I say, people remember Foley's bumps, but if you look back and you think about your favorite wrestling memories, and you'll remember these moments and how you felt, and a lot of them won't be centered around a bump.
yeah.
So while the bumps are a necessary part of the industry, they're not the be all and end all. And if we're working any kind of show business, the place where you want people to be completely invested in you is when you finish. So the end of your match is not more important than the start, but the people's reaction to you at the end of your match is more important than the reaction to you at the start of the match. If you're not over at the start, you can work to get over and make people feel something. But you don't have to take 50 bumps in a 10-minute match to do that. You just have to connect with people. And like I say, the wrestling is wrestling is the journey, but it's not the destination. And the bumps are the same. They're just a means to an end. And that end is to get people to be engaged with your persona, your character, and who you are, because that's what they pay to see ultimately at the end of the day.
That makes a lot of sense. And thank you. That's exactly the kind of stuff I look for on the channel, is that kind of philosophy. So I really appreciate you diving into that. Now, I do want to go back a little bit, because you said something interesting. You talked about training with Mr. Kevin O'Neill, and you said he's not necessarily the person who taught you everything, but he taught you the fundamentals. From there, did you learn psychology from a different school, or is this something that you just learned later on in general? Because, of course, you learn more, but...
Yeah, so I mean, that psychology becomes developed over time, working with better people, whether that's in the ring or whether that's away from the ring. For me personally, after a couple of years of wrestling and learning those basic fundamentals, a guy who was at our shows, who was actually selling videotapes, he was an editor and videographer for FWA over here in Britain. His name was Barry Armbars, and he took a group of us aside, and he just taught us this one little thing, and it made so much sense. And we swapped numbers, and from there we started working together. Me and a group of us, Drake Maverick, Rockstar Spud, he was one of them, and a few others, a few other guys on the British scene as well. And we started working with him regularly, looking at our matches, and not necessarily looking at what we did, but looking at the why.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that with him for a little bit, for a few years, and obviously then getting that regular work and putting it into practice. working with better wrestlers as well gives you that kind of chance to develop. And then from there, my grasp of professional wrestling that improved it a bit. And then when I went to OVW to work with Rip Rogers, that's when it really that's what I'd say changed everything for me, because some of the things I'd learned helped me get to that point, but then working there was just eye opening, and that's when I that's when I really felt like I understood how to engage the crowd fully and how to work the crowd and read them, understand them, and all those kind of things, and understand the business as a whole, because it's not just about your match; it's about the whole show.
What I find interesting about you and your career is, maybe early on psychology and whatnot wasn't something that was really driven home, but you talked about later with Rip Rogers. And then, of course, NXT UK, when you eventually got there, you had some of the best ever, some of the best minds just there at your disposal. Again, I'm jumping ahead, but were you able to take advantage of that, of some of those minds while you were there? I'm not sure what your schedule looked like specifically. For example, I talked to Jack Stars. Guys, check that video, the whole video, the individual videos, check it out. It's great. But he talked about, training with, he didn't get to train with Finley, unfortunately, but Johnny Saint, he did a lot of training with Johnny Moss. Uh, Regal, I think, came by and would train a little bit. Brian Kendrick came up to train, and he's a channel favorite. So I'm curious if you're able to take advantage of that too.
Yeah, there was a lot of things at our disposal there for us to use definitely, and it was it was something that I was able to use a little bit, but the schedule over here in NXT UK was very different. And I mean, I got to work with Shawn Michaels and Triple H, Regal, Terry Taylor, and it was great to have their opinion and their input. And it was the kind of thing. I mean, there's a couple of guys there that I mentioned who were always very open and honest with me, and I was always able to go to and ask them about things. The kind of the format of how NXT UK used to run, I would say, wasn't the most beneficial for someone like myself at that stage of my career.
Mm-hmm.
So that the whole setup wasn't geared towards someone like myself. I having the chance to sit there and pick out things in my matches with the guys we just mentioned is really, really valuable,
Mm-hmm.
and something that really helped develop me. But we didn't really get to do that enough for my liking, if I'm honest, because obviously the way the schedule was, they'd come over for we'd report to the PC normally for a week or sometimes 2 weeks before TV, and then we'd get some of the guys came over, Shawn Michaels or Triple H and Regal or whatever. They'd come over just for a few days before TV, so we didn't get as much time hands on with those people as we did with Mossy or Brookside or whoever. So it was completely different, and I think that setup, that system, was great for some people, especially those who were earlier in the career. But for more experienced guys, it wasn't. It wasn't as beneficial for us as it was for the others.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I want to go back again. The earliest match I could find for you on record was August 24th, 2002. It was yourself and Deacon Despair against a star athlete and Kevin O'Neill, who you mentioned before. Was this your first match?
No, that would have been maybe my third or fourth match or something, maybe. My first match was May the 4th, 2002.
Okay.
At the Victoria Leisure Centre in Nottingham, England, against a star athlete who was in that tag match that you just mentioned. That was he was a work colleague of mine. We used to work together making glasses in a workshop, and we kind of I said, "Oh, I'm going to this wrestling training," and he was a wrestling fan. He said, "Oh, I'll come with you." He was about 7, 8 years older than me, and he said, "Oh, I'll come with you and I'll try it." And so said, "Okay," and he tried it and stuff, and he kept at it for he probably wrestled himself for about 7 or 8 years.
Okay.
And one day, basically, we went to Nottingham. We'd only been training 5 or 6 months, maybe. We went to Nottingham. Deacon Despair, Kev O'Neill, they were wrestling on that card. We went along with them on the understanding of we were going to help set up and do the ring and things like that. We did set up and we finished that, went out, grabbed a bite to eat and a drink. We got back to the arena and we got back to the venue and they turned and said, "Oh, Dave, Neil, you guys are on first. You got 10 minutes." And we went, "Oh, okay." And had to go and get changed and put some semblance of attire on and go out and do a match.
Did you think you were ready at that time? Then and in retrospect.
At that time, probably. And in retrospect, I was ready to be on a show. Was I ready to be on a show with another guy whose first match it was? From my personal opinion, no, because you just don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a great mix to put two completely green guys on the show together. It's it's the blind leading the blind. So in an ideal world, when you make your debut, you should be in there with someone who's experienced and knows what they're doing and will help you to take the match in the right direction.
How do you think it went? And more importantly, perhaps, how did other people react? Like, did you get feedback? Were they happy with it? Was it okay?
It went okay. I'm not going to say it was perfect. It definitely wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
but it went okay for a first match, 10 minutes. Two completely green guys. The feedback that we had from the promoter and the other people was absolutely fine. There was nothing really detailed in it, but yeah,
Good start.
it just seemed to go well. If that, I've never seen it back. I never will see it back. I don't think it was filmed, so I can't say how awful it was in retrospect, and I can't say how good it was for the circumstances. So it was what it was.
I want to dive into where your head was at the time in terms of goals and what you wanted out of wrestling, because it was a very different time, when it comes to British wrestlers making it, quote unquote, making it. Today, you can see so many from England, from the UK, from Europe, in WWE alone. You can, even right now, there's so many. Back then, it was much more limited. What were your prospects? What did you hope for? What did you expect?
So my overall goal when I started wrestling was to wrestle professionally and support my family, pay my bills. That was my overall goal. My dream was to sign for WWE. So, and at the time, it was more unlikely because nobody had been signed by WWE or WCW or anything like that since Regal and Finlay. And even then, there was no kind of way into what would start to become their developmental system and things like that. So there was no pathway, but I just knew I had to do it and I had to find a way. And that was kind of that was my mindset really at the time.
Yeah, because I find it so interesting. I think it was might have been Kaylee Ray, Alba Fire. She mentioned something to the effect of, when Nikki Cross got signed, the thought process was, well, there's the Scottish quota, right? Because at the time, you'd only really get maybe one person from a region getting signed. So for you, and I'm fast forwarding a little bit, when a few people got plucked away, like the Drew McIntyres, the Wade Barretts, the Sheamuses, or even a few other people before that, Was your thought process, wow, this is tangible, this is real because somebody locally got signed? Or was it, well, there's a spot gone?
No, I always thought that it was possible. I never looked at it and thinking, oh, well, they're never going to sign me, partly because I had a belief in myself, and also because I always endeavored to make myself different from the people that were already signed. And the thing is, you can't control what what that company or any company, you can't control what they want really. They have a certain checklist or demographic that they go after, what they're looking for in their recruits. And especially over the last, if you go over the last 12, 15 years, maybe, those requirements that they have or those desires that they have for new recruits may have changed. I mean, if you look back to maybe 2008, 2010 kind of time, everyone that they signed was short hair, no facial hair, little six pack, little bit of a tan, jock looking type guy,
Randy
and
Orton.
that yeah, that was their kind of goal. They seemed to sign as many people that look like that as possible. Cody DiBiase. Um, Gosh, I mean, you could go back and look at like the FCW website,
Yeah.
2010 or whatever, and you can see it was cookie cutter, for want of a better term. They all had very similar looks and styles and whatnot. And then fast forward, and their ideas change a little bit, and then it changes again, and it kind of goes in this little cycle. But you cannot control what they want. Almost, you just have to present a package that when they see it, they go, "Oh, we like that. We think that that can make money. We think that can be beneficial." So it's you can say you can either fit the mold if you're lucky enough to fit the mold of what they're after, or if not, you can be so far out the box that you instantly become some form of attraction for them.
See, that's such a smart standpoint and stance on it, because it's got to be tough, at times when you're seeing, this is the kind of person they're molding, this is the kind of person they want. So for you to have that insight of, well, if I can't be that person, then I want to be something completely different. That way I'll stand out and be special in that way. So that's such a cool way to look at it. And it shows, why you lasted for so long, and it shows why you eventually went on to reach your goals. You know what I mean? And that's something I would love to emphasize on this channel too, is like, so many people are career driven, right? They're next goal driven. You're always looking at, well, this is what I want to do next, this is what I'm hoping to achieve, this is what, sometimes it's hard for people to sit back and, smell the flowers, or look back and look at what they've done and appreciate it. And even if it's just for, half an hour or an hour on the show, I like to reinforce that you've done some awesome stuff. Like you specifically, you've traveled to so many countries, you've wrestled on TV in your home country, you've signed with WWE, you were making that's every dream you had as a kid that you got to live. And sometimes it's hard to look at that because you're always thinking about what's next or what could have been. And I think sometimes it's hard. Do you find it that way?
Yeah, I think a lot of people do get lost in that kind of mindset. Um, I, like I said, I've done a lot, and I've achieved all the things I wanted to achieve, really. But I do know, like when I look back, and I'll speak to some of my friends from over the last 20 years or so. We look back, and the best times we had were definitely on the way to where we got, and someone like Ashton Smith, I've known Ashton since maybe 2006, something like that. And we become good friends. When we were in WWE, we roomed together, so we were roommates. And we spent a lot of time traveling together, wrestling together. We did the British camp show circuit together. So, and we look back, and those are some of the best times we ever had. a group of 5 to 8 of us or whatever, traveling in a van, putting the ring up, wrestling on the show in front of a packed house, popping that ring back down, jumping in the van, going to the next one, doing the same thing there, getting that ring back down, crashing on the night, going to have a few drinks and have a laugh and whatnot, sleeping in the back of a van sometimes because we didn't have accommodation, but just having some truly great times with some great people, and that's something that a lot of people don't consider. They look at where they are now or where they've been, and people can get bitter about what could have happened or what could have been. But genuinely, I'm not going to say the best time of my career was X or Y or whatever, but personally, the fun that I had just growing up and becoming a man, and getting to share that with some really cool people, with times like that. And then if I look at things from a creative standpoint or a career standpoint, there's other moments that stand out, but it's not. But like I say, it's you need to look back and don't take things for granted, and really enjoy those moments, and value the friendships and the connections you make along the way, because they're worth so much more. And a lot of people, their sole identity is that of their wrestling persona.
Mhm.
That is all that they have. And when that disappears, because at some point in your life, that will go. You can cling on to it for as long as you like Ric Flair, for instance,
Mhm.
but it will leave you at some point, and you will no longer be that individual, that persona, because you will lose the physical ability, or you will lose the opportunity. So if you invest yourself emotionally too much into that persona, when it's gone, you're going to become very lost very quickly, and that's when people struggle with their mental health and things like that. So invest your time, invest your emotions into the other things as well, into the friendships, into those connections. Learn, do something on the side, learn something else, be proactive with that, because at some point, no matter who you are, professional wrestling will be gone, or your professional wrestling persona will be gone. So if you don't want to fall off a cliff emotionally, you need to make sure that you've got those other things around you.
I think that's great advice, not just for wrestling, but especially for wrestling, because it's a physical industry and your body can only hold up so long. But honestly, in anything, like you've got to always, you've always got to you look ahead, but appreciate the moments while they're there. Uh, might bring up something controversial here. The U.S. version of The Office. There's a quote that people always say, and it's, "I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them." And generally you can't, but if you can try to just take that moment to appreciate it. But like you said, you also need to be able to detach yourself a little bit. And I don't know, I think what you brought up, you mentioned Ric Flair, and it's a great example. Like, some people can't let go, or they become so consumed with the spotlight or their character that it becomes them. And there's only so many people. Like Ric Flair, he can make a living being Ric Flair to this very day, even if he's not in the ring, but most people can't. So that's got
Yeah.
to be a hard thing to reconcile with when you're done.
Yeah. So the thing, my kind of mindset, I always kind of looked at things, and there's an English football manager called Neil Warnock, and he gave a team talk once, and his team talk involved him. It was his players, some underdog team playing at a big team, and he basically told them to go out there, and his words were, "Enjoy it, but enjoy it being fucking disciplined." So that's kind of the mindset that I kind of went for in my career. So when something would happen, when uh, I'd have a certain match or a certain event or a certain show, I'd put everything into it, and then once it was done, I'd instantly kind of look back and say, like, for instance, takeover Cardiff with NXT UK when me and Joe Coffey did the last man standing match. You know, we put everything into that and worked so hard. And for me, then once it's done, it's gone. So we finished that match, finished the show, wonderful show, great match, whatever, and or great event. So I went back to the hotel afterwards and I sat there at the hotel bar with a couple of my friends, and we had a drink, and we just kind of said that was a great night. Really loved it, enjoyed it, and then that was it. Forgot about it. What's next? But definitely savoring the moment and enjoying the fruits of your labour at that very time. Once business was done, once work was done, enjoy it, and then move on.
I love it. I love it. And you've been a great guest. Only have time for a few more questions. I've loved this chat so far. I can't wait to get you back on in the future. Like I said, I love these. We get in the weeds. We love to pick the brains because, like, for example, even mental health. You brought up mental health, and mental health in wrestling is such a. I feel like it's something that wasn't talked about for a long time. Because it's a stigma everywhere, but especially in pro wrestling, because pro wrestling is a macho industry, right? And it's for a long time it wasn't something that was able to be covered. So I appreciate you even bringing that up because I feel like it's something that needs to be discussed more. Something I did want to discuss though, your ring name. Early on, before you became, the Bomber, before you became Dave Mastiff, you were Morales, Dave Morales. How did that happen? How did you get that name? Because from the outside looking in, it seems like a strange name for you, but I'm sure there's a reason behind it.
Not really in many ways. So, like I said before my first match, we got told maybe an hour before the show started we were on first and we were going to have a match. So at that point, I barely had any wrestling gear, didn't have a gimmick, didn't have a name. So in the space of an hour, we had to put together a match, and then I had to borrow some attire, bits and bobs. I then had to come up with a name for myself, and brainstorming that kind of thing in an hour, 45 minutes or whatever. All I came up with was basically there was a boxer, lightweight Mexican boxer called Eric Morales, and I used to enjoy watching his fights. So I just went, oh, Dave Morales, and that was literally it. It wasn't exactly uh, a great light bulb moment or a real hard kind of dive into what I could call myself. It was literally I just did that. So then that's what stuck for a little while. And then you're obviously you're going to ask about the name change.
Yes,
I
sir.
presume next.
Yes.
Yeah. So basically, that happened when I went to OVW. Uh, we come to do the first show. The first couple of weeks I was at OVW, the Davis Arena, and told him my wrestling name, and he's up on the run sheet backstage. And Rip Rogers walks past and he said, Dave Morales, who the fuck's Dave Morales? Oh, yeah, that's me. And he went, you're not fucking Mexican. Yeah, I know. You need to change your fucking name, kid. Okay. So I then spent the next, again, just a few days. They wanted to call me Manson or Mason. And I said I can't do that because Madman Manson was a wrestler in the UK, good friend of mine. James Mason, who's a well-known wrestler in the UK as well. So I couldn't take either of those names. I just sat down for a couple of hours, spoke to my buddy back home in England, and we just said, let's just go with Mastiff, Dave Mastiff, and that was that.
Honestly, such a powerful name. Like it immediately draws people's attention towards you. Plus, obviously, you're a big, strong guy, so it's very fitting in that sense, right? Like it gives off a powerful image that is befitting of the wrestler. Not that the other name was bad, but it's just by comparison, I feel like Dave Mastiff is a star name. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I didn't think too much into it again. I know, it just kind of seemed to fit. And and then it stuck, and it just become. I mean, once I saw Lance Storm once said, "Has there ever been a more fitting name for a pro wrestler than Dave Mastiff?"
Yeah.
And in terms of me, in terms of how it suits me, so I guess it kind of stuck, and it was the right decision in the end. So
Was it difficult for you when you came back, working with the new name? Like, were promoters a little weirded off by it? Because, like, here you are, if you've worked a place for years, now now you have a completely different name in marketing. Did that matter to them at all?
not really. I mean, that was the at that kind of time, 2010. That was like the very start of the British scene starting to rise.
Mhm.
So most promoters, they liked the fact that I'd just been at OVW for 3 or 4 months, and they'd seen they'd obviously streamed the TV show on Wednesday nights from Louisville, and they'd seen the name change, and it kind of it kind of upped my stock a little bit. So they went with the name change, apart from one place where they were a little bit resistant to it. And I kind of said, do what you want. I don't give a crap. And eventually they went, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. But um, but yeah, they just went with it. I think they found it a bit more credible, and me being in OVW and things like that added that little bit of credibility and stuff like that. So
Again, I'm jumping ahead here, but I am curious because I think he was gone by this point. When you did OVW, was Cornette gone by that point?
yeah, Cornette wasn't there. So I went to OVW in September 2009, I think, and that was not long after WWE had pulled out their developmental system from there. So, but the reason for me going was I went because I had a little bit of a friendship with Doug Basham and Nick Dinsmore when they came up to the UK, and we hung out quite a lot, and I learned a hell of a lot from those two, wrestling with them, training with them, and things like that. And they encouraged me. I said I want to go somewhere. I want to develop myself. So I want to go to some kind of dojo or school just for a few months and really dive into it. And I looked at a few places, Harley Race in Missouri, for instance. Um, but I think that would have been like a 6 week thing, whereas I could have gone to OVW for 3 4 months. And Rip Rogers there, and after speaking with Nick and Doug, they kind of convinced me that that was the place to go. So I went there to train with Rip Rogers. Basically, if I never wrestled a show for OVW, I wouldn't have cared because I went to train with Rip. But I did get to wrestle. I wrestled every week on TV and multiple times at house shows and things like that. But the guys who were there then was Mike Mondo was running beginner class, and Rip was running the advanced class. Danny Davis was the owner. So it was a good crew, solid crew.
Oh, that's great. Mike Mondo, he's a guy who has a great mind for wrestling too, and obviously a lot of that came with Rip Rogers, Jim Cornette, and the training he got there. But then also he got to do a main event loop with Shawn Michaels and Triple H and Ric Flair. Like, that kind of knowledge you probably just can't replicate.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, Mike Mondo's got a fantastic mind. He's a fantastic worker, and that was a kind of there was a kind of theme to that in OVW. All the guys there, even guys who'd been wrestling, under a year, just had a great attitude and a great mindset, and they could do pro wrestling really, really well. And I would at the time I was comparing these guys who'd been wrestling 6 9 months or whatever to people who'd been wrestling 3 or 4 years back in England at the time. And the guys who were wrestling 6 9 months under the tutelage of Mondo and Rip Rogers and Danny Davis, and they were streets ahead of people, absolutely streets ahead. So it shows how good the pedigree of OVW was.
And what's so beneficial, and I'm gonna allude to the Jack interview again. He talked about how he had his first training, and at one point they were pretty much straight up like, we can only teach you so much. So then he started training with Robbie Brookside, and once he was training with Robbie Brookside was going to the United States and training at the PC, training other people, and then bringing that back. So in that way, what I find interesting is what you learned in OVW, you were then able to take back to the scene and maybe pass along to some people, at least those willing to learn. And now to this very day, lessons you learned from Rip Rogers, you can pass along to the next generation of stars. So that's the best way to, keep that education going, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I did. I spent that time in Louisville in OVW, and I came back with just so much from it. And I would even as I was learning these things, I'd call my friends back home to catch up with them and tell them what I was learning and all this kind of stuff. And the moment I got back, we used to have a little unit with the ringing, me, the Hunter brothers, the Clark brothers, a couple of guys on the British scene, and we would go and train, a couple of times a week or whatever in that ring, and just going over the stuff that I learned in OVW, and that little group kind of grew, and then uh, we brought Tyler Bate in and Trent Seven, and these guys, and we had this core group of about 8, 10 guys, and we were just, we were really working our asses off to make each other better, and to really delve into, pro wrestling and being the best pro wrestler you could be.
All right, so we're back. Just had to take a quick intermission. One thing I wanted to make sure we cover, because look, we've talked about this even before we got going. You've had such a long career, and I don't do brevity very well, as I'm sure you've noticed. So we're definitely gonna have to talk more in the future. But I did want to talk about NXT Europe, because that has been heavily rumored. Not even rumored; it's been openly discussed. It was supposed to come this year. It didn't end up happening. There's been a lot of complications between the sale, a certain person retiring, a certain person coming back from retirement, and supposedly it's going to be happening in 2024. Now, you have had a great career. And then in NXT UK you had great success. Unfortunately, the brand shut down. In a future interview, definitely want to talk about that. Would you have any interest in returning for NXT Europe if the opportunity came about?
Yes, but it would obviously depend on the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I've got expectations for myself, and I have expectations for what I feel should happen within a company I work for. So if those things are met, and if the opportunity was exciting and aligned with my values and my goals, and not just that, if it if it made if it enhanced mine and my family's life, then yeah, of course.
As far as NXT Europe goes, what do you foresee coming with it? Because NXT UK, it got hit hard by a few things which really slowed down the momentum, right? Again, this is something we'll discuss in the future, but the pandemic being the biggest thing, but there was a few things that slowed things down. What do you think? What's your outlook for NXT Europe? Do you expect the Performance Center? Because I talked to Axel Tischer, Alexander Wolf, and on the channel, he said that he expects for the PC to either stay where it was, basically in England, or to be in Germany, because those are kind of like the two hotbeds for European wrestling. What would you expect?
So I think it would be the London PC again,
Mm-hmm.
mainly because the tour manager and head of operations is based in London.
Mm-hmm.
So he was the guy who looked after the PC on a day-to-day basis. And I don't think, knowing him, I don't think relocating to Germany would be his thing. So I would expect it to be in London. I don't know what NXT Europe would look like. Again, I'm not privy to that information. But I assume it would kind of fall in line with what their current recruitment strategy is. And if you look at NXT in the US and look at the people that they're signing to contracts and things like that, and their current business model, I assume it would follow something along the lines of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. A mix of athletes who don't have wrestling background, and then you'll have the veterans, like especially right now, NXT is littered with a lot of NXT UK people, interestingly enough, So the only other part of that I find interesting is what kind of schedule do you think they would have for the Performance Center? Because, you have the United States Performance Center, which is so intense, it's constant, but from what I understand, the NXT UK one wasn't quite as active. Would you like to see the NXT UK or wherever it be for NXT Europe? Would you think in a perfect world, whether you're part of it or not, that it should try to replicate the US one as much as possible in that sense?
It's a tricky one because from an outside perspective, whether it follows that model or not
Mm-hmm.
depends on how successful you deem that entity to be.
Yeah.
Basically, if you think that and I mean, the WWE obviously probably think that it's been massively successful, so that they will probably want to emulate that.
Mm-hmm.
The issues that they might face are more logistical. So, for instance, when it comes to their USPC, it's based in Orlando, down in Florida, and it's a pretty cushy place to be. Year-round sunshine, 0% income tax rate. Not too bad, is it? Whereas, big international airports, travel and stuff like that. Whereas when it comes to the UK one, you had guys from all over the UK, and it was based in a suburb of London. And for the most part, nobody wanted to be in London because London is probably very similar to New York.
Expensive.
And nobody wanted, like, there was, and like in terms of the cost of living and things like that, to then get people to go down to London full time becomes very, very expensive.
Yeah.
Because if you want people in London full time, whether it's someone like myself moving from the Midlands or the Gallus boys moving from Scotland, people from Manchester or wherever, if you want people to relocate to London, you've got to relocate their families. And secondly, as well, because of the cost of living, how much more expensive it is in London, you have to significantly increase what you pay people.
Mm-hmm.
There's no chance people are moving to London for the kind of contracts that they offer at developmental level, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, some people probably would, but I think on the whole, if you're thinking realistically and in terms of the financial implications it would have, then it would require a lot more spend to do it that way.
And at that point, they just have to decide if it's worth it to them and if they can afford it. Well, I mean, of course, they can afford it, but you know what I mean. Last question. We'll get to plugs. I'll ask this every time we talk in the future. You know what I mean? I like to ask this of every guest, no matter, like, we've had Sal Renaro on, and I'll ask him every time. What does the future look like for Dave Mastiff? It can be wrestling, it can be life.
To be honest, I'm not really sure.
Mm-hmm.
I have no real grand plan. If I'm perfectly honest, I'm enjoying my life with my family and see my son grow up, things like that. In terms of wrestling, it would have to be, a really exciting project to be part of. Again, it would have to be something that was rewarding financially, rewarding creatively. I mean, I'd possibly be looking to go into coaching more as well. That's something that interests me because I think I've got a vast kind of span of knowledge and experience that I think could really benefit a lot of people, and particularly guys at the top end as well, in terms of certain companies. And I think I could really be beneficial to them, and it would be something I'd be interested in looking at, maybe.
I definitely agree. You have a great mind for wrestling, and I appreciate that you were willing to share some of that today. One more time, where can people check you out?
So on Twitter, it's at Dave Mastiff. On Instagram, it's at Real Dave Mastiff. If you want to show your support, if you fancy buying one of my t-shirts, I've got 3 or 4 designs up on Pro Wrestling Tees. think if you just type my name in the username, they're there. So that'd be great. I've got some. I think these are the most badass t-shirts I've ever designed, to be perfectly honest. So, people should get on them more, I think. Yeah, that's me. That's where I am.
And we will have links to that store and to his socials in the description, guys. Again, show some support. Thank you again. You were a great guest. Guys, check us out on Twitter/X at Armbars and Sidebar, or at Armbars Sidebar, on Instagram at Armbars and Sidebars, and subscribe to us on YouTube at Armbars and Sidebars. If you leave comments, we always respond as long as they're not hateful, Just we try to share the love of wrestling, tell people stories, because wrestling is such a unique industry. I always say even the most boring pro wrestling story is far more interesting than almost anybody else's. I love that about wrestling. So thank you. You were great, and I can't wait to have you back again.
No, thank you very much, and I look forward to returning with you. It'd be really interesting because we've only scratched the surface of a lot of the things I've done and my experiences. So it'd be great to come back, and I think I could probably talk for 4 or 5 hours. If I'm perfectly honest.
And I would love every second of it. We'll definitely come back. We'll talk about NXT UK. We'll talk about Progress. We'll talk about Japan. We have so much to cover. TNA. Thank you so much. And until next time, guys, later.